In March 1958, after 3 years of construction, the New Zealand Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was completed.
This ambitious construction project was notable, and during the open house, over 112,000 people flocked to see this new addition to the New Zealand religious landscape.
But behind the scenes was something far more notable. In spite of the labour and material shortages of post-World War II, both school and temple were built almost entirely by a volunteer workforce. Hundreds of labour missionaries that were called to consecrate their time and talents and sustained by the offerings of local members. This is the story of the young men, young women, and entire families who sacrificed personal gain and comfort to build a school for their children and a temple to their God. Such a thing had never happened before and has not happened since.
But this story begins much earlier with the building of another school. In 1913, drawing on both member and headquarters support, the church completed construction of the Māori Agricultural College near Hastings. Its purpose was to give the rising generation vocational and religious training and help them develop leadership skills.
The MAC, as it was affectionately called, started out with great promise. But by 1930, enrolment had dropped and the school was struggling to keep its doors open. In addition, the church had recently decided to withdraw from regional education projects such as this one, and it was announced that the MAC would be closed.
On September 3, 1939, New Zealand joined the other Commonwealth countries and declared war on Germany. Foreign missionaries were called home, except for their mission president, Matthew J. Cowley.
It was the practice at the time, when church membership was new and inexperienced, that missionaries and mission presidents would often fill key church leadership positions.
With no missionaries to choose from, President Cowley called local members to fill the vacated positions. As the war years dragged on, he noted that the men who had attended the old Māori Agricultural College were the ones who were both willing and capable leaders. After the war, Matthew Cowley was called as an apostle, and in September of 1948, the First Presidency announced another school would be built in New Zealand.
It was to be centrally located, accredited, open not just to Māori, but anyone who wished to attend. One of the American missionaries who had to leave New Zealand in 1940 due to World War II was Elder George Biesinger.
Elder Biesinger had worked in construction before his mission and planned to return to that business when he got home. As he was leaving New Zealand, he told President Cowley, "When you're ready to start building, I'm your man." Matthew Cowley didn't forget that young elder, and 10 years later, George Biesinger, now an experienced builder, was hired as supervisor of church construction in the South Pacific. The massive amount of materials needed for such a huge project was just not available in a country recovering from the effects of war, so the church looked for creative ways to meet its own needs.
A sawmill and a piece of timberland near Kaikohe were purchased to provide the lumber. A quarry at Wharewhara was obtained to supply the rock that would be crushed for concrete.
A block-making machine shipped from California was installed into a plant where the millions of bricks could be made.
Next came the joinery, where windows, doors, and other wood components were manufactured.
With the supply chains in place, construction began with a small crew of full-time workers.
But it quickly became apparent that it would be impossible to hire enough skilled labourers to build such a massive project.
As leadership considered the problem, discussions turned to a program that was used to build meeting houses in Tonga. But its success rested on being able to recruit a volunteer workforce who could learn on the job. It was decided to bring it up with the local membership. Mission President Sidney J. Otley and James Elkington, who had worked on the Tonga construction projects, took an entire conference session of the 1952 Hui Tau to explain the volunteer building program.
Workmen would be set apart as labour missionaries, but the local church branches would need to supply food, clothing and money to support them.
The proposition was put to a vote. The assembly gave their unanimous support to the project.
From that huito, a call had been sent out, and its effect was far-reaching. The number of volunteers grew and the workforce was organised. Church headquarters called missionaries with construction skills from the United States to lead and train the teams of young labour missionaries.
There was a transportation crew, a plumbing crew and a painting crew. The joiners did the carpentry work, the brickies did the masonry work, and the sparkies did the electrical wiring. Young women were called to work in the construction offices.
Besides taking care of their families, the married women living in camp were also recruited into support groups, helping with kitchen work, gardening, and sickbay duties. And when the site became overrun with visitors, they also became tour guides. Living conditions at the construction site for the workers were very basic. The single men shared bunkhouses, while families were assigned small huts known as batches. Hundreds of meals were prepared each day by the kitchen staff and fed to the crew in Kai Hall. Since food was provided through donations from the district members, sometimes the cooks had very little to work with.
Each week the missionaries received a small live-in allowance for personal items. It wasn't much, yet despite the low pay, difficulty of the work and the challenges of the living conditions, spirits were high.
At first the work went slowly. The land was largely a peat bog and the constant rain made it worse.
By 1953, 7 married couples with 20 children lived in the married quarters and 83 men in the barracks. Although their quarters were temporary, this group would eventually become the foundation of the Temple View community, some spending their entire lives there. But back at church headquarters, there was growing concern about the project. Financial support from some of the districts lagged, and there were also serious cost overruns on the construction. It was suggested that perhaps it would be necessary to cut back on some of the plans.
About this time, Elder Biesinger happened to meet Wendell B. Mendenhall, a prominent businessman and stake president from California, who had served in New Zealand as a missionary and had returned to visit.
He had extensive experience working with construction contractors and was intrigued by this unique project. The two men hit it off immediately. Before leaving, President Mendenhall offered to do anything he could to help after he got back home.
He was also a friend of David O. McKay, and when it was announced a year later that President and Sister McKay were going to tour the Pacific, President Mendenhall volunteered to accompany them at his own expense. Instead of accompanying the McKays, President Mendenhall was asked to take a different, confidential assignment. He was to travel to New Zealand, perform an audit of the expenditures of the school project, and while he was there, find a location he could recommend as a potential temple site. After several days of travelling across the country, he had identified several possible spots, but he felt he should visit the school construction site one more time. He later recorded his experience.
While in the car on the way, the whole thing came to me in an instant. The temple should be there by the college. The church facilities for construction were already there, and that was the centre of the population of the mission. Then in my mind, I could see the area, even before I arrived, and I could envision the hill where the temple should stand. As soon as I arrived at the college and drove over the top of the hill, my whole vision was confirmed. In my heart, I felt that the Lord had especially made this hill for His temple. Everything about it was so majestic and beautiful.
But President Mendenhall did not have a chance to mention his impression to anyone.
And when President McKay arrived to inspect the school construction, he was travelling with 3 other brethren, and the subject did not come up.
They drove to the same spot where President Mendenhall had stood. As President Mackay got out of the car, he took President Mendenhall by the arm and pulled him some distance from the rest of the party, turned to him and said, "What do you think?" President Mendenhall knew what he meant, but simply replied, "What do you think?" President Mackay said, "This is the place where the temple should be." The 1955 huito was held at the college construction site. It was here that Elder Biesinger announced that a temple would be built on the hill above them using the Labour Missionary Program. About 4,000 members were in attendance, and they gave the project a unanimous sustaining vote.
It was also announced that the school project would not be cut back as previously feared, but instead was to be expanded. 2 new buildings were added, one for the administrative offices, which would become the Matthew Cowley building, and another containing an auditorium, gymnasium and swimming pool, which was named the David O. Mackay building.
Elder Biesinger, President Mendenhall, and newly called Mission President Ariel Balliff broke ground December 21st, 1955. About 600 people attended, and immediately afterwards, heavy equipment moved in to start the excavation.
When construction on the temple started, there were 14 American tradesmen and 150 Labour missionaries on the site. That number grew to 36 craftsmen and over 200 missionaries.
Likewise, there was growth in the construction village as well, as engagements, weddings and births became part of their little community. Their numbers grew to 235 people.
As the construction became more visible, so did interest in the project. Sightseers would come visit in large numbers. During one weekend in October 1956, over 600 visitors arrived. A year later, those numbers would grow to exceed 4,000.
Proselyting missionaries acted as guides during the week, but on weekends, the women from the project took over.
As the temple started taking on its final form, those who worked on the project began to feel an increased reverence for what they were building. Joe Apeti, one of the workers, recalled, "At the earlier stages of building the temple, all the orders were being shouted. The closer it got to completion time, the quieter and more reverent everybody got. Pretty soon they were talking in whispers, and it was so amazing. Everybody was whispering and talking in low tones because the house of the Lord was nearly completed, and they honored that."
As the temple neared completion, the open house and dedication dates were announced.
But even as the crews pressed on, opposition struck in the form of bad weather. Torrential rain washed away landscaping and created major setbacks. In response, members rallied from all over the district, giving up weekends and holidays for the final push. The workforce grew to over 400.
Finally, after 3 long years, and in spite of floods and dark of night, the temple was completed right on schedule. And as the doors opened to the public, the building and grounds were flooded again, but this time with thousands of people from all over the Pacific area that wanted to see this beautiful house of the Lord.
Over 112,000 people filed through the 7-story, 75-room temple during the 23 days of the open house.
When President Mackay arrived a few days later, 6,000 members from across the Pacific area were there to welcome him and attend the dedication ceremonies.
Kia ora. Halafalava. Malolele. And everybody, thank you.
The New Zealand temple was dedicated in 6 sessions on Sunday, April 20th, 1958, with President Mackay reading the dedicatory prayer. As part of that prayer, he made special mention of the Labour missionaries.
We invoke thy blessing particularly upon the men and women who have so willingly and generously contributed their means, time, and effort to the completion of this imposing and impressive structure. Especially we mention all those who have accepted calls as labour missionaries and literally consecrated their all upon the altar of service. May each contributor be comforted in spirit and prospered manyfold. May they be assured that they have the gratitude of thousands, perhaps millions, on the other side for whom the prison doors may now be opened and deliverance proclaimed to those who will accept the truth and be set free.
During the dedication, it was discovered that some members who had made this once-in-a-lifetime trip had hoped to receive their temple ordinances immediately after the dedication.
But after a temple is dedicated, it is usually closed for several days to be cleaned and readied for use. For those whose travel schedules could not be changed, there was little hope of receiving temple ordinances before they had to leave.
With permission from church leadership, the labour missionaries stepped in again. They cleaned and prepared the temple in a matter of hours and then, acting as ordinance workers, laboured through the night to allow those who could not stay the opportunity for temple blessings. It would be perhaps their last great service and sacrifice as labour missionaries.
The following Thursday, President Mackay also dedicated the church college.
Then the following evening, in an emotional meeting with church leadership, the 185 remaining labour missionaries, some who had served for years, were released.
The motto of the Church College of New Zealand was "Build now for eternity." But perhaps no one understood that principle better than the labour missionaries who built it.
They sacrificed their time, comfort and material gains in order to build a school and a temple that would benefit others for generations to come.
In 2009, after more than 50 years of operation, the Church College of New Zealand closed its doors. And like the Māori Agricultural College before it, took its place in history as another great chapter in the quest of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to bless the lives of its members, neighbours and friends.
And though the school may be gone, what the labour missionaries built still lives on.
It lives on in the hearts and minds of those educated in the school they built.
It lives on in the blessings of ordinances given in the temple they built.
And it lives on in their example. An inspirational monument built of faith, sacrifice and dedication, given freely for the good of others.